Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BAPT conference session on conflict style and type by John Hackston. What are the pros and cons of conflict? How does it make you feel? And how does this relate to type? This interactive session draws on recent research to answer these questions and shows how type can be used alongside the Thomas-Kilmann model of conflict. And without further ado, I'll pass you on to John. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thanks for that lovely introduction. So good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, I think, for some of you, depending where you are in the world. Welcome to this session. As Nick says, this is all about conflict style and type. So for the next hour, we'll be looking at conflict, in particular conflict in the workplace, looking at how it makes you feel, what's perhaps good about it, what's perhaps bad about it, and also how all of this relates to type. And as Nick said, we're going to be drawing on some research that we did at the Myers-Briggs company last year, based on the model of the TK model, which Ken Thomas and Ralph Kilman developed, looking at how that conflict style relates to type as well. So as you can see, my name is John Hackston, and I'm head of thought leadership for the Myers-Briggs company, which is a lovely job title, but one of the things it involves is getting involved in research. And I'm going to be sharing, as I said, some of that with you today. But as Nick said as an intro, we're going to try and make this as interactive as possible. It isn't just going to be me talking. There's going to be a few things for you to do as well as we go through. So let's kick off. I think we just have one more person about to join. So let's kick off by doing a little bit of that interactivity and asking you a question. How does conflict at work make you feel? So if you'd like to perhaps pop a few opinions, a few answers in the chat, and we'll see what sort of things you come up with at the moment. I'm just going to talk about something else for a minute, and then we'll come back and see what you've said. And if you don't want to share, that's fine as well. And just while you're putting a few things in the chat about how conflict at work makes you personally feel, this is one question which we asked in that research that we carried out last year. And as well as looking at how conflict makes you feel, we looked at the things that might cause conflict, what's good and bad about conflict, how it relates to things like leadership, who handles conflict best, and how it all relates to other things that you feel about your job, things like job satisfaction and engagement. And all of that information is put in detail in a research report. Now, this report, I have to say, runs to 65 fun-packed pages. So it won't be time to go into all of this detail today, but you can download it from that URL, or you can scan that QR code and actually download that report. But let's see what sort of things you've said in the chat about how conflict makes you feel. Forgive me if I not look at you for a moment, because I have you on a separate screen over here. So wait to clear things up and get on the same page, says Sharon. Lynn, stressed and at times undervalued. Nick, unsettled, you prefer to have fun. Tim gets angry. Lisa gets tense and triggered to figure out how to bring people together. Elizabeth, it depends. Okay. Isabel, very disturbed. So a whole range of different answers there. What's interesting about those answers are there's a lot of negativity in there, but there's some positivity, and there's at least one, it depends as well, which Elizabeth then goes on to talk about in more detail. Now, that question was one of the questions, as I said, that we mentioned in our research. One of the questions we asked people who took part in our research. And these are the sorts of answers they came up with. We asked, just like you, we asked them an open question, but we're able to categorize the answers into a range of themes that they fell into. And these are the sorts of things that people came up with. So the most common response, similar to some of you, was about being anxious and depressed and fearful and stressed. Then awkward or uncomfortable, angry, at least one of you was angry, demoted, they disengaged. But then 10% of people said, actually, conflict can be useful. 7% of people said, actually, it can be quite exciting, quite engaging and challenging in a positive way. 6%, I don't know if you took part in this survey, Elizabeth, said it depends. So there's a whole range of answers here. And as you can see, the balance is on the negative side.
Hello, John, are you there?
Hope I didn't freeze there. You all look very still if I didn't freeze.
Yes,
Yeah, you're back again.
You're
Excellent.
back.
Sorry, I felt I froze for a bit. It was either I knew either I'd frozen or all of you had frozen. So probability-wise, it was probably me. So what you're seeing there, I was about to say, is that there's a lot of negative things going on, but some positive things going on as well. And all those numbers you might notice add up to more than 100% because some people's answers cut across a whole range of themes. Now, there were some type differences as well in the way that people answered questions. So in terms of the preference pairs, what we found with preference and people with a feeling preference were more likely than others to say conflict made them feel awkward or uncomfortable. The numbers in this graph, by the way, is the percentage of people with that type preference who mentioned this particular aspect in their feelings about conflict. People with an introversion preference were more likely to say they felt demotivated or disengaged or helpless. And people with a thinking preference more likely to say, actually, it depends. So there were some type differences in that data as well. And there's more of that information in the report. I've frozen again.
Hi, John, can you hear me?
And Anna, back in, yeah, I can hear you again. Sorry, I bear with me. Something is clearly not as good as it could be with my internet. Whenever I freeze, I can see you all freezing, so I'll just pause and go on and let you, you will start moving again. So I was about to say, our feelings about conflict are going to be affected by what we think conflict is, how we define conflict. And this is how we define conflict in our research. Any situation in which the concerns of two or more people appear to be incompatible. And that obviously doesn't have to be negative. And if you think about it, a lot of innovation can come out of places where people are trying to find solutions to problems where their concerns might seem to be incompatible. Many negotiations, in fact, will start off in that way. So that conflict doesn't have to be negative. But let's try and make this a little bit more precise. Let's ask you a question. Now, Nick, I'm not going to ask you to launch a poll because there's so few people. So I think we don't need to launch a poll on this one. I'm just going to ask for a show of hands. So I'd like to know overall how you see workplace conflict. Does anybody think it always or almost always gives positive results? Let's have a show of hands. Put your hand up if you think that's the case. Okay. Oh, Sharon, thank you. Thank you for being the one person for answering that particular option. Anybody think it actually generally gives more positive than negative results? Okay, another one of you. How about a mix of positive and negative results? Okay, a few of you are putting your hands up there. Generally more negative than positive? Yeah, one or two of you. I think we may have seen everybody always or almost always gives negative results. Okay, thank you for that. Again, we asked people in our surveys question, and actually they came up with quite similar answers to yourself. The majority, or just more than half, were in that place where they felt that conflict gave that mix of positive and negative results. But if you look at the rest of the data, actually, these people were a little bit more negative than you were. Twice as many people felt it gave more or less negative results compared with the people who felt it gave more or less positive results. But there are still some people, as in your group, there are still some people who felt that there's positive things that can come out of conflict. Conflict isn't necessarily all bad. Interestingly, there was a type difference in how people answer this question. There was a difference in terms of one preference pair. Any suggestions, any guesses in what type preference pair showed a difference in how people saw workplace conflict? And you can put something in the chat or you can shout out as you wish. Any guesses? No one going to go for it? ENTP, we have from Lynn. TNF from Isabel. We just looked at this at the preference pair level because the numbers were not always big enough at the whole type level. But what we found was, and it was a statistically significant result, that people with a introverted preference were more likely to see conflict in a negative way. And if you look at the numbers in a bit more detail, you can see that 15% of those with an extroversion preference saw conflict more or less positively, but only 9% of those with an introversion preference. On the other hand, 35% of introverts saw conflict more or less negatively, compared with 22% of those with an extroversion preference. So some people see conflict in a positive way, some people see conflict in a negative way, but I suggest that those people with an introversion preference may be a little bit more likely to see it negatively. But let's think a little bit more about what those outcomes might be. What might be the positive outcomes or the negative outcomes of conflict? And we're going to ask Nicholas in a second to split you into two groups. And I think you can go for 2 groups of 4, Nicholas, if that's okay. Or by all means, put yourself in the groups as well, if you like. And I'd like you in your groups to discuss what you feel those positive outcomes could be, what those negative outcomes could be, and if you have time, perhaps how those answers relate back to your type preferences. I'm going to give you 8 minutes for that discussion. Any questions about that? And as I can see some of you doing, please feel free to take a screen dump or take a photograph of this if you need to remind yourself what the questions are. Okay, any questions before we go into your groups? In that case, Nicholas, if you'd like to get out your magic wand.
Yeah, so 2
breakout
rooms,
groups.
8 minutes. I'm going to create it now. I'm just going to put the time as well.
Excellent. So that invite should be winging its way to you in just a moment. This gives you time to think about your answers before you get in the group, of course, which is fortuitous but useful.
Okay, open all rooms.
Excellent. So once you see that invite, you can pop into your room. Thanks, Nick.
Right.
Yeah, I think with that smaller number of people, doing the polls is probably a bit overkill, which is why I just did it by a show of hands.
Yeah, it's good numbers.
Okay, good. I could pop in, but I'll leave until it, I think. So 8 minutes from now. Let me check my timing. That'll give me to... So by the time we've talked this through, we'll be halfway through the session, pretty much. Okay, let's slide on my own. Okay. I may truncate some bits later. We'll see how we go for time.
Okay.
Yes, because my internet is freezing. It's taken a bit longer than I anticipated, but hopefully this will be okay.
What I'll do, I'll just pause the recording.
Now, of course, what I didn't do before you left in your groups was to say, you might want to appoint a spokesperson for your group. So I'll say that now. You might want to appoint a spokesperson for your group. Who'd like to go first? Go on, somebody, go for it. What were the positive outcomes? Sharon, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I think the positive outcome is that when there's pushback, it's going to reveal the downside to any idea that I might have, or a blind side that I simply don't have. And I think it increases our group IQ. We can have a great, robust conversation about things. And I just think we all get smarter as a result of it. So I think we need hard conversations.
So it could give rise to those new ideas, let those things be heard, solve problems. Yeah. Any other positive aspects from this group, from your group or the other group? Anything else?
I think we were also talking about by letting it out, you don't fester. If you're heard, you can move on. But if you're not heard or you don't get it out, it gets worse. Sorry. Oh, there we are on the video. He's frozen.
That's okay. Yeah. So getting things in the open, letting things out, that was good. Anything else? Any other positive aspects?
You know, I mentioned in our group that sometimes relationships can become stronger, basically making a negative situation and turning it into a positive experience for both. And more trusting relationships could result if both parties are committed to a positive end result.
So sometimes, conflict can almost forge those relationships. Any other positive aspects? Okay. How about the negative aspects? What could the possible downsides of conflict be? Anybody?
This is Molly speaking, and my contribution was it has a lot to do with the norms or how conflict is handled in a space.
Okay.
And the after effects, the conflict resolution, the training that is offered around how to handle conflict. Because if that doesn't happen, I think there's an accumulation of the negative conflicts, things go underground and they're really not resolved. And it can eat organization from the inside.
So it's the opposite of what I think Tim and Anne was saying about letting things out into the open. Yeah. Any other negative aspects?
John, I think it comes off the back of the conversation we were having, but it can be positive or negative, really, that our experiences of conflict can reinforce or repair our previous experiences of conflict.
Yeah.
So a positive experience, it can repair previous experiences, or if we have negative, then it can kind of reinforce that for us.
So if my INTP type references, I quite like the meta-ness of your answers there, that conflict can affect our experience of conflict. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have one comment in the chat as well. Sharon said Lynn had a great comment about this in the breakout. Well, I may have missed a boat on that.
I said it keeps you if you get that conflict out, it lets you live in the present moment. Where if you keep it in, it's just going to keep compounding, like adding rocks to that briefcase. Okay. It's heavier.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Now, given the way I presented this so far, it's probably of no surprise to you to hear that this again was a question we asked people in our survey. And these were the sorts of things that we found. So the positive outcomes, the most common response, again, these numbers add up to more than 100%, was building relationships, as some of you have mentioned. Then achieving a better solution, getting results, the sort of thing that you were talking about, Sharon. Then change, having greater self-awareness, individual growth, and so on down the list. Interestingly, 10% of people said, there's no positive, it's all bad. Destroying relationships, destroying trust, reducing cooperation. People become disengaged. People become angry. And interestingly, 7% of people said actually there are no negative outcomes to conflict. But I think one interesting thing here is that this chart, for example, shows that many people saw conflict at work as destroying relationships, whereas many people also saw conflict at work as building relationships. And if you compare those two charts, conflict at work really is very much a double-edged sword. It can be positive or negative. It can build relationships or destroy them. By airing those different viewpoints, you can achieve a better solution, or you can delay projects and get poor results. You can bring in new ideas, or you can ride roughshod over and ignore people's views. You can improve communication, or you can impede communication. So given that conflict can have both these effects, I think it's so important that we learn ways of dealing with conflict, ways of managing conflict in order to achieve those positive aspects rather than finding those negative aspects. Interestingly, we did also see some type differences here. People with a preference for extroversion and people with a preference for feeling were more likely to mention better communication as among the positive aspects. People with preference for intuition, and this perhaps isn't surprising at all, more likely to see change, innovation, new ideas as amongst the positive aspects. On the negative side of things, people with a perceiving preference, more likely to mention anger and resentment, more likely to mention bullying and harassment. People with intuitive preference, more likely to mention disengagement. Again, the numbers here represent the percentage of people in each group saying this. I'm tempted to make a throwaway remark about Dominic Raab here, but I resist the temptation. Oh, I've just done it. There we go. So we've talked about how conflict makes you feel. We've talked about the positive outcomes. We talked about the negative outcomes. What are the main causes of conflict at work? What do you feel the main causes of conflict at work are? Any suggestions in the chat? Or just shouting out?
Self-interest.
Self-interest, okay. Any other suggestions?
Resistance to complying with regulations and rules that you don't agree with, because it limits what you want to do.
Yeah. Okay, wanting to do your own thing or resisting rules, yeah. What we did in our survey was to, sorry, I think you're saying something, Molly, but you're muted.
Lack of agreement on some of the main purposes or goals of the work.
So lack of agreement in the main purpose of goals, and we have in chat disrespect, my way is the right way, personality clashes, politics, people not pulling their weight, differences of opinion, lack of mutual purpose. What we did in our survey is we went through previous research and we came with a list of causes that had been mentioned in previous research, and we said, which ones of these do you think are causes of conflict at work? And this is what we found. So poor communication came top, lack of role clarity, heavy workloads, personality clashes, one of you mentioned, changes in policies, dysfunctional teams, people with different values, and again, so on down the list, right down to those lucky souls who said, or perhaps not lucky souls, because conflict has its uses, who said there's no conflict in my workplace. And if you look at those top three there, poor communication, lack of role clarity, heavy workloads, a lot of those are to do with how organizations are structured. A lot of those are going to be to do with management and leadership, but perhaps type has some role to play there as well, perhaps in particular in improving communication. But again, the fourth most common cause of conflict was about personality clashes. And this obviously is a place where knowledge of type, the sort of things we're hearing about in the keynote earlier, increasing our self-awareness, using tools like personality assessments, using tools like conflict assessments can really help to diffuse those clashes by helping people to understand each other more thoroughly. I'm going to ask you one final question. I'm not going to ask you to shout out your answers because it's a little bit unfair to get you to shout out your answers to this one before we go on to look at summarize what we've got so far. How well do you feel you manage conflict at work? I'm not going to ask you to put your hands on this one because it's a little unfair to ask you to say that. But just think to yourself, do I manage conflict at work myself very well, quite well, adequately, poorly, or very poorly? This is what people said in our survey. 49% of them said adequately, but 41% said they manage conflict very well or quite well. So most people, this may relate to the Dunning-Kruger effect you heard Rob and Gareth talking about earlier, think they manage conflict adequately or very well or quite well. Very few people say they manage conflict poorly or very poorly. And this survey was entirely anonymous. There's no reason for people to make themselves look good. And again, there was a personality difference. And again, it was on extroversion and introversion. On average, people with an extroversion preference felt they managed conflict better than people with preference for introversion did. 55% of those with an extroversion preference felt they managed conflict very well or quite well, compared with just 32% of those with an introversion preference. Again, this isn't necessarily saying anything about how well people actually manage conflict, but extroverts clearly felt they managed conflict, on average, better than introverts did. We may see some reason behind that when we go on in a moment to look at the TKI conflict model. So this, I think, is where we've got to so far. We've seen our conflict is often more seen negatively than positively, may particularly be seen more negatively by those with an introversion preference, who may also feel they themselves are less good at working with conflict. But conflict can have positive as well as negative outcomes. So the way that we deal with conflict, where we manage conflict, is important. Let me just pause there and check the chat and ask if anyone has any questions so far. Okay. So far, we've been talking quite a lot about research. We've been talking perhaps in generalities. Let's get down to specifics. Let's get down to what actually might happen in a conflict situation. And when any of us are in any form of conflict situation, any place where our objectives seem different to the other person's, there's really different factors that influence what might happen. And some of those are about the situation. Some of what we do might depend on how much time we have available, how complex this thing is, how important it is to us to preserve that relationship, how important the issue is to us, how it relates to our values, all of those sorts of things. But some of it is to do with our individual preferences. We all have our individual type preferences. We all have our individual approach to conflict. And what we actually do in any one situation is all about the interplay of those two things, who we are and the situation. Arguably, you might think it should have more to do with the situation. In practice, it might have more to do with us and our habits and the way we habitually approach conflict. By the way, if any of you are taking pictures of these slides, please feel free to do so, but I am going to send a PDF of the slides that you can download later as well. What we've looked at in our research is this model of conflict called the TKI, the Thomas-Kilmann conflict mode indicator. And it starts with this idea that we all have habits. We all are creatures of habits. We tend to take a standard approach to any given situation. And if we identify what our habits are in a conflict situation, if we identify the way we normally do things, we can then have the power to actually flex our behavior and do things differently when it be a better response to the situation. Very much in a way that we may be able to flex our type behavior if the situation demands it. And let me have a quick physical show of hands. Who here has heard of a TKI before? Okay, Sharon has. Some of you have, some of you haven't, okay? So for those of you who have heard it before, please bear with me while I quickly go through what the TKI is all about. It's based on two observations about people. First of all, that we're all more or less cooperative. For some of us, satisfying other people's concerns is really important. For others, it's much less important.
Yes.
And we're all more or less assertive. For some of us, satisfying our own concerns is really important. For others, it's much less important. So if we look at someone, for example, who was at the bottom left of this chart, someone who was low on cooperativeness and low on assertiveness, in terms of what the TKI looks at, we'd say they had an avoiding style when it comes to conflict. This is someone who isn't trying to meet their own needs, but they're not wanting to address the other person's needs either. These are people who might try and avoid the conflict. They may try and postpone or sidestep an issue rather than addressing it directly. And it might be that they don't address it right now, which they have some very good reasons for, or they may not address it at all, which may be less useful. Some people have an accommodating style. These people are unassertive but cooperative. These people want to really fully satisfy the concerns of the other person without regard for their own needs. On the opposite side of things, people who are competing are assertive but uncooperative. These people want to win at all costs. They want to satisfy their own needs, and if that's at the expense of the other person, hey, that's absolutely fine. And if you use either that competing approach or that accommodating approach, if you like, this is a zero-sum game. Someone wins, someone loses. For competing, you win, they lose. For accommodating, they win, you lose. Collaborating is a bit different. Oops. Collaborating is a little bit different. It's both assertive and cooperative. These people are trying to satisfy their needs and trying to satisfy the other person's needs as well. It's a win-win, not a win-lose. And that may sound really great, but as we'll see, collaborating isn't always the best approach in all situations. All the approaches have their uses. And last but not least, compromising is partially assertive, partly cooperative. These people are trying to find an expedient solution, a pragmatic solution, a mutually acceptable position that satisfies both people. Some of your needs to be met, but not all of them. Some of the other person's needs to be met, not all of them. And it's a bit like sharing a pie. You have concerns, they have concerns. How much of a pie will you get? How much will they get? If you look at the five modes through that lens, accommodating, they get all the pie. Competing, you get all the pie. Compromising, you share the pie. Some of your concerns are satisfied, some of theirs are satisfied, nobody is 100% satisfied. And all of these are zero-sum approaches. There's only so much pie to go around. But let's look at the other two modes. With avoiding, you're not dealing with a conflict at all, at least not now. So neither of you is satisfied. And avoiding can actually work really well when we know that we're going to come back to the issue later, when the time's right or it's more appropriate to do so, but it may be less effective. It just means you're putting it aside and you're never going to deal with it. But with collaborating, both of your concerns satisfied, in effect, you've made a bigger pie. So that conflict doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. So we have these 5 conflict modes: competing, avoiding, compromising, collaborating, accommodating. Each has different goals, each has different uses, and as you can see from this slide, each of them has different behaviors associated with them. And you're very right, Sharon, compromising if done too soon keeps us from having an important dialogue about a problem, or can be, but sometimes it is the right mode to use, as we'll see. Now, I had thought that we might do a little exercise here, but looking at the time, we won't have time to do that, so I'm just going to talk this through instead. This is something you might want to think about just for yourself, perhaps after this session. Think perhaps of a situation where you have to negotiate one-on-one with somebody else. So think about the situation first of all, and think about what approach you adopted in that negotiation. Was it competing, or collaborating, or compromising, or avoiding, or accommodating? What did you actually do? And then think about how successful that was, and did that approach match your goal? So if you went in and did a accommodating solution, accommodating approach, because that's what you do, was that matching your goal? Did you need to yield to that person? Or actually, did you need to win or reach a win-win instead? Did the approach you use actually reach your goal? And perhaps also go on to think about how your type preferences influence your approach and what perhaps you could have done differently. And you may want to think, as we're going through this, what your own favorite mode is. Each of those modes has different goals, different uses, but most of us do have 1 or 2 favorite modes, and we do tend to overuse those, but underuse others. So think about perhaps what your own favorite mode might be. Obviously, the way of doing it is to take the TKI assessment, but even now we can start to think through, how does this work for me? What might my favorite mode be? Let's just say a little more about each of these modes. And I should say that when people start to think about these modes, they often wonder, is avoiding ever useful? We're not meeting the other person's needs, we're not meeting ours. Everybody loses. And sometimes avoiding is counterproductive. If you're just sticking your fingers in your ears, which I can't do because I've got headphones on, hoping things will just go away, then it really isn't very effective. But avoiding can be useful too. Sometimes the issue just isn't that important, or it's become much less important. Sometimes you might need things to cool down. You need to diffuse the situation first, or gather more information. And sometimes perhaps it shouldn't be you who's dealing with that particular issue. And I think the important thing here is all 5 conflict modes have their place. All 5 conflict modes have their uses. All 5 conflict modes can be useful. On the other side of the scale, you might think, why not use collaborating all the time? It's a win-win. Everybody's needs are met. Hooray! Well, because it can be hard work. It can be stressful. It takes time. Everyone involved needs to really trust you and trust the process. Everyone needs to be willing to take part. And you're going to need damn good interpersonal skills to have all of those conversations and make it happen. In more intense It takes more effort. It takes more time. But if you can do those things, again, it can be useful. Collaborating has its place. It has its uses, as do all of the 5 modes. With competing, that can be useful when things need to happen really quickly, or when you genuinely need to force things through and there's no alternative. Accommodating can be the best approach when this is something that's really important to a person, but not really important to you at all, or when you want to use that to help build the relationships, or sometimes you may think, oops, I was wrong there, or perhaps you haven't got the expertise. And finally, compromising has its place too, notwithstanding what Sharon said about it earlier. So all 5 modes have their uses, and different situations are best suited to different modes. And all 5 strategies are equally good when we use in the right situation. But because we're creatures of habit, we tend to have 1 or 2 modes that we use more than others, even though all 5 modes are at our disposal. So the important thing to remember here is that you have a choice. You can choose which mode to use. You can steer conflicts in different directions by choosing different modes, and give yourself time to think. Because if you react immediately, in a moment, without thinking through your behavior, you're probably operating in your favorite mode, you're operating out of old habits, and that might not fit the situation best. So we've talked a bit there about conflict and the TKI model. I hope you give you a little bit of a feel for what it's about. Let's finish off by linking up back to the MBTI and back to type. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm just going to go for a show of hands here. And there is an answer based on research. Which do you think is the most common favorite mode of those with introversion preference? So a slightly odd sentence I put together. So for people who have an introversion preference, which mode is most likely to be their favorite? Okay, have a think about how you might answer that question. Obviously, everybody's different. There'll be people with an introversion preference with every mode as their favorite, but one might be more likely than the others. Any votes for accommodating? Ooh, Isabel says yes, as is Elizabeth. So 2 votes for accommodating. Any votes for avoiding? Elizabeth's hedging her bets here. She's going for avoiding as well. Any votes for collaborating? Nobody? Competing? 1 vote for competing. Compromising? 1 vote for compromising. 2 votes for compromising. 3 votes for compromising. Any votes for I'm really not sure? Oh, and I think it was another vote for compromising just came in. Something like compromising came in top in the end. According to our data, this is what we found. 38% of people with an introversion preference in our study had avoiding as their favorite mode. But actually, one important thing to look at on this graph is the avoiding graph for extroversion, because 20% of extroverts had avoiding as their favorite mode. So here's a question for you, for you to think about rather than necessarily answer straight away. If you have somebody with an extroversion preference who tends to use avoiding a great deal, versus if you have someone with an introversion preference who tends to use avoiding a great deal, what differences in behavior might you see between those 2 people? Are they going to behave in exactly the same way or differently? Sharon?
I think what would happen is that the extroversion people, their version of avoiding might be to tell others. In other words, not the person they're having the conflict with, but other individuals, and to bounce it off of them and to really gossip about them and vent and go how terrible this person is and how frustrated they are with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think with the introversion, it's going to be more interior, considering, but again, not necessarily voicing all those things on the exterior side.
So the extroverted people, with personal extroversion, they're going to talk about the conflict, but not with the person they should be talking to. They're talking with everybody else and avoiding the actual conflict situation in that way. Yeah. Any other suggestions? Okay, I'll do the big reveal. Let's get near the end of the session.
I think introverts.
So,
sorry.
Can I click back so you can talk without that in front of you?
Go on. Speak.
So you were about to say something.
Yes, I think introverts can also, as it were, try and garner support from other people. But they're particularly good at leaning on other people to enunciate what they can't say themselves or don't feel they can say themselves. Perhaps more manipulative.
Okay. So that's sort of, getting other people to do it instead of them almost.
Yeah.
Okay. This is what I have on my slide. The first thing therefore, the extroversion side is actually interestingly very much the sort of first couple of things, very much the sort of thing Sharon was talking about. Might distract from the conflict by having a conversation about anything else. Might speak about the conflict with everybody but the people involved. They say, I need more time to talk this through before we actually really get into it. May be quite stressed about it and get less engaged, and make themselves unavailable to talk about it. They don't want to get drawn into talking about the conflict if you're using an avoiding style. Whereas on the introversion side, they not talk about it at all. They shut themselves off and ignore requests of others. They say, I need more time to think about this. They just try and avoid having contact with both people at all. And interestingly, if they've done that in the past, sometimes people with introversion preference may feel they haven't been heard or considered.
Yeah.
And as a result, that resentment may build over time.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't just made these up. I've actually taken these from this booklet, using the TAKER assessment, the MBTI assessment, which is a free download you can download from that URL, or you can scan a QR code. And it's got what was in that slide there for E and I, for avoiding, but also how each of these different conflict modes are likely to play out for each preference pair, also how it might relate to type dynamics, and how it relates to the process pairs, what we used to call the functional pairs, ST, SF, NT, and F. So do please take your time to download it after the session, and there's some really useful stuff in there. So we have, according to my clock, 4 minutes. I say clock, it's a little number on my screen. We have 4 minutes left. So let me just try and draw things to a close. So things we've talked about conflict. We've talked about how it makes you feel, some of the pros and cons around conflict, what might cause it, and how it relates perhaps to our type preferences. We've talked about the TKI model, what it is, how it might relate to how to negotiate. So do take time to think about exercise after the session, how you may have a favorite mode, a favorite conflict style, and how it might be useful to adapt your style to different circumstances, and how those dimensions of conflict relate to type. There's a lot more in the research about that, a lot more in the document about that. And we've mentioned a couple of takeaways that you can take away from today. You can download the full research report and also the using the TKI and MBTI document. And again, you can scan those QR codes. So with 3 minutes to spare, good Lord, that doesn't normally happen. With 3 minutes to spare, we're just about at the end of the session. Let me ask if anybody has any questions, because we did go through things reasonably quickly. Any questions that you might have? Or have I stood you all to silence, or you're all desperate for a cup of tea, or coffee, or gin, or your beverage of choice?
Well, I have a comment, an observation about type and gossip. It came up I mean, it came to me when you were looking at the differences between E and I, and I'm trying to put it together with the functions, because I have been in groups where people who have gone through the MBTI have confirmed their type, and I also in coaching. So I have seen INTP, INFJ, and INFP, and there's something about the hook of gossip. It has something to do with the feeling function, almost like a gray side of the feeling function.
Okay.
It's a question. That's more of a question.
I mean, on one hand, gossip is an indication of an interest in people.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps a less positive manifestation of that. Interesting.
Right. And
that's my next research.
I would have attributed it just to people with a preference for extroversion, but it has something to do, there's something else going on, I think, with gossip and the use of the extroverted feeling function maybe, but it might go across types or something like that.
Well, I wonder also, and I'm just thinking this entire top of my head, if in those sessions where you've seen that happen, that feeling function is combined with the thing we had in the keynote about finding your tribe, when those feeling folks are getting together suddenly to recognize each other, that might spur that a bit. But I'm just, ignore that by all means, because I've just thought about the top of my head. It's probably absolute rubbish.
Well, I only have a sample of 4 people, so I can't really say. Just an observation.
I think people call that qualitative research, so that's fine.
Well, we'll keep it within this group.
Any other questions? Anything else you'd like to ask? Anything else you'd like to find out? Well, Sharon, go ahead.
I think in the end, one of the things that we have to really consider is the fact that we all need skills training in this area, that it's just so critical for all of us to have this, and to again use type as a point of curiosity, to try to figure out, is that what's happening, and to try to understand. And I think the other part of it is to be more curious than curious about things. I think we'll approach it that way. You're a greater chance of being successful versus deciding, I know what the other person is up to, and those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And I think, building our self-awareness and building our curiosity about people is one way of helping us deal with and work with conflict. And it takes us away from that, that person just doing that deliberately to pay us off, which is a place we can get into if we're not careful. Okay, it's we've eaten 1 minute into our into your break time. I apologize for that. Any final questions? In that case, thank you. Hope that was interesting. Hope that was useful.
Thank you.
Pardon me. And I'll hang around a minute if anyone's got any one-to-one questions. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.